So there is a secret to getting the green light to your ideas, your messages, and your content. And here it is. Or there was, you know what? There was supposed to be a music cue there, and it was going to be epic. But just imagine epic music right there, because it was awesome. But this is the secret, that we are all smart, capable, and good. Now, I'm actually serious about this, and there will be a quiz later, so remember this. Because if you don't, it could drive you insane, like this guy. This is Ignaz Semmelweis. Now, Semmelweis was alive in 1847 in Vienna. He was a doctor in a teaching hospital there. And this teaching hospital had 2 maternity wards. There was one for teaching doctors and one for teaching midwives. They wanted to keep the patient levels even, so they admitted women on alternating days. But the patient levels weren't even because of 2 reasons. One, women were doing everything possible to avoid one of the wards. And they were doing it because of the second reason. They were much more likely to die there. In fact, 1 in 5 women didn't make it out of one of the wards alive. But in the other ward, it was 1 in 50. They were much more likely to survive. Now, what was causing these deaths was something called childbed or puerperal fever. It was a blood infection. But what was causing it, and where did it come from? Especially since women were dying more often in the doctor's ward. But then one day, one of Semmelweis's fellow doctors dies of childbed fever. And I assure you that he had not just given birth. Now, what had happened was he had nicked his hand with a scalpel after performing an autopsy on one of the women that had died. And that gave Ignaz an idea, because only the doctors performed autopsies. So he wanted to try an experiment. But that experiment meant doing something a little different, because this was 50 years before germ theory. At the time, doctors at the height of the knowledge thought that disease was spread by giant sheeted skeletons, which was really just a representation of something they couldn't see. They called them miasmas, or bad air. And this bad air was detectable by bad smells. So the experiment was to wash the smell off of their hands. And it worked. The mortality rate plummets to match that of the midwives' ward. And Semmelweis declared the savior of mothers. He gave them a green light to life. Now, that's not the whole story. Because as hard as it may be to believe, Semmelweis's fellow doctors gave him a red light. For reasons I'll explain, they rejected him. They rejected his idea. They fire him. They stop washing their hands. The mortality rate goes back up. And Semmelweis, now, with nobody wanting or believing his idea, and the fate of all of those women now sealed, literally goes insane. And in a tragic finale to this, within 2 weeks of being committed to an insane asylum, he dies of a blood infection, just like those women he wanted to save. Now, far less dire, but we have Semmelweis moments like this all the time. Times when we want and need to get a green light to our ideas, our message, and our content, and we get red lights instead. Now, I have worked for smart, capable, and good companies for 20 years, and all of them experience these red lights. So see if some of these sound familiar to you. Okay, red light number 1, no attention. And that's where people don't act at all. You don't get a green light, nothing happens. And because this is pretty much our job in marketing, to get attention, like Semmelweis, it can be fatal. But it can also be fatal to our companies, like not just our jobs, but companies, because CB Insight says that the number 1 reason why startups fail is because there's no market need. Nobody wants it, or nobody believes they do. Now, red light number 2 is where they want what you have, but they don't want you, sorry to say. And so they give you a red light. They may give a green light to your competitor, which happens in B2B like 32% of the time. But the worst is that 21% of the time, they just shut the lights off and go home. They decide that nothing is better than what anybody else has to offer. Now, red light number 3, no confidence, also known as buyer's remorse, is when they want what you have, they even bought it from you, and then they start to question that decision, which means they start to question you. And I'm going to bet that somebody just popped into your mind because 40% of B2B purchase decisions, more than 40%, end with buyer's remorse. Now, has anyone here not seen one of these at their companies? Okay, good. So you're my people. Because I want to help. I believe I can. But first, we have to understand what is causing these red lights and the green lights in the first place. And that is your brain. Now, Harvard Business School professor Gerald Zaltman says that up to 95% of our decision-making is unconscious. Without you realizing it, when presented with new pieces of information, your brain is deciding on 3 things. Number 1, whether or not you want it. Number 2, whether or not you believe it. And number 3, whether or not it validates the other 2. Whether or not that new information is consistent with what you already want and believe. When you get those 3, it's like the green light goes on and it stays on, and you get that green light that we need as marketers, where people are willing to change, willing to act, willing to do something different. But too often, we don't get those green lights, we get the red lights. So let's talk about these 3, starting with this one. Now, it may seem kind of obvious that we always want to give people what they want, give the people what they want, but it doesn't always happen that way. But let me try this experiment, Semmelweis style. Okay, I need you to think of something that you really, really want right now. Maybe it's another cup of coffee, maybe it's a promotion, maybe it's abs of steel, I don't know. I pretty much want cake all the time. You may remember this from last year. And so I'm going to put that up. You can borrow my cake. All right, this is important. Here's how the experiment goes. I need you to think of something that you really, really want. You've got it in your mind? Now, unwanted. Did that work? No, of course it doesn't work, because we don't readily unwant things that we want, and it's easy to give the green light to those things. Now, contrast that with trying to get someone like your kids to do something that they don't want to do, like eat their vegetables. Not so easy, right? But this is the same thing that happens when we tell people to just buy our stuff. We're saying, you should want this, and they're saying, no. Now, let's say they do want it. They have to believe that you will deliver on it. So, as an example, let's say that you are looking for a new SEO company, and you do your search on Google, and you find these guys, Best SEO Company 2019, and you find them exactly where you would expect to find the Best SEO Company 2019, on the 9th page of results. Do you believe them? No, you don't believe them, and they kind of know that, because if you click through, you're going to find this ringing endorsement that says, this is the best digital marketing agency I know. Now, that's a ringing endorsement. Let's see, who is it from? It's from Bob Proctor, renowned wealth expert and teacher of The Secret. Different secret. And Bob, I know that thoughts become things, but I think you could probably visualize yourself to something higher than the 9th page of results. You know, in a lot of ways, we need to remember this. In the words of mathematician Blaise Pascal, that people are generally better persuaded by the reasons which they themselves have discovered than by those which have come into the minds of others. In other words, we believe our own reasons, our own experiences most. For example, I live in Boston. I'm not from there, but I have lived there long enough to have a Bostonian alter ego named Karen O'Sullivan. Now, if you live in Boston, you are required to have an opinion on where you get the best lobster roll. And Karen will tell you that the best place to get it is actually not in Boston, but you have to drive an hour and 40 minutes north to this park outside of Portland, Fort Williams Park, and oh my God, there's a food truck there. It's the most amazing lobster roll you ever did frickin' see. It's like Tom Brady just smiled from above. Now, you know, she and I still want to try ones that are maybe closer to home, and so we do our research, and we found this one, Freshies. Now, it was voted the world's best lobster roll. All right, sounds pretty good. Karen's like, we got to go. So we start to explore, and we discover that Freshies is in Utah. Okay. Quick geography lesson here, because where are the lobsters? By the water. Utah, there's no water. And by the way, how fresh do you feel after flying 5 frickin' hours to Utah? All right, so we're going to believe that. Even if we want it, we're going to believe it when we eat it. And until then, Portland. Okay, now you may say to me, Tamsin, come on, I do things all the time that I do not want to do, and I have bought things that I did not believe would work. And I'm going to say, yeah, that's probably true. It was a very convincing infomercial. I'll give you that. But that's because there is a massive difference between action and change, between getting the green light to come on once and getting it to stay on. And while it might be tempting to think that the best way to create that change is to change what people want and believe, it turns out that the only way to create that long-term change is to leave those two unchanged, to validate what people already want and believe. And this is what our buddy Ignaz Semmelweis did not do. But just 10 years later, someone else did and got a very different result. Now, this time it's a woman, it's a nurse, and instead of caring for women in a maternity ward, she's caring for soldiers in the Crimean War. And the mortality rate is much higher, not in battle, after it. That's what you see in the blue there. 9 out of 10 soldiers are dying of things like typhoid, dysentery. Things that we know now are caused by germs, bacteria, the cadaverous particles that Semmelweis thought were creating the bad smells in the first place. And while she, like Semmelweis, doesn't know about the germs, she does have the same theory about hand washing and sanitation. And not only does she get the green light from the doctors to wash their hands, she gets it to stay on, and they keep doing it. She's directly credited with reducing the mortality rate. She's directly credited with setting the foundations of modern nursing. As you probably have guessed, she is Florence Nightingale. So why did Nightingale succeed where Semmelweis failed? Because she validated the most important want and belief of all. You remember the secret to getting a green light? Because here it is. Epic music. This one, that we are smart, capable, and good. Now, I said this was important, and it is, because this is one of the most important basic human needs. We want to be smart, capable, and good. We believe we already are smart, capable, and good. And even if you don't believe that you're smart, capable, and good, you want to be seen as smart, capable, and good. Now, the problem is we don't always act smart, capable, and good. And this gap between I'm a good person who did a not good thing is one of the most physically, emotionally, mentally painful things that poor unconscious decision-making brain we've got can experience. It is so extraordinarily painful, in fact, that our brains will take extraordinary measures to relieve that pain. It will start to create stories that make that pain, that make that gap go away. Things like, well, that's not what I meant, or you must have misunderstood, or Janice left the M&Ms on our desk. What was I supposed to do? Leave them there. So actually, let's talk about that one, because I know that's a kind of story that I have told myself very, very often, and maybe you have too. So you'll do something like this. You'll work out today. Maybe you already have, and you really didn't want to. So clearly, that makes you a super good person, right? So that when you see those M&Ms, you're like, well, I am a super good person, so I deserve these M&Ms. Even though I, as a former Weight Watcher leader, will tell you that you have to walk the entire length of a football field to walk off the calories in just one. The workout ain't going to cut it, but your brain is like, no problem, we're super good, we're going to work out tomorrow. Like, this is not rational. Because we are not rational, and neither are your clients and customers. Humans are not rational decision makers. We are rationalizing decision makers. We create stories to justify what we do. And so you see what this means is that we don't do things because they're right. though we believe we do, we think the things we're doing are right because we are the ones doing them. Do you see this difference? Now, this rationalization, by the way, is completely and totally normal and human. I'd be worried about you if you didn't do it. The danger comes in not realizing that you do it, or not realizing that your clients and customers do it too. Because this rationalization is a trap. I like to call it the rat trap, because it is exactly where your content, your ideas, and your messages go to die. Because this is where people talk themselves out of change. And it's what's going on with these red lights. So with no attention, the story that you tell yourself, the rat trap is, I don't want it. With no decision, the rat trap is, well, I don't believe this is worth it, or I don't believe you can do it. With buyer's remorse, no confidence, the rat trap is, I don't believe that you are as smart and capable as I am, so I'm going to make your life a living hell.